Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 325, Bob Dylan, Tangled Up in Judaism. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And just a reminder that you can now register for our second set of classes as part of our 3-week sessions for the Onion Yeshiva this spring. Our second set of classes include a class on gender identity and Jewish mysticism with Abby Stein, a crash course about Karaite Judaism with Sean Lisha, and a class on Jewish storytelling and canon with Marcus Hawley, who is going to be our guest next week. So we'll get into that in depth. But if you want to sign up for those classes, head over to judaismunbound.com/classes, and you can do that. And we are really excited to have you join these amazing spring classes with some of our favorite guests ever on the podcast. And now, let's welcome our guest for this week's episode, Stephen Daniel Arnoff. He is the author of a new book called About Man and God and Law, The Spiritual Wisdom of Bob Dylan. If you remember, a few weeks ago, we talked to Harry Friedman about the mystical roots of Leonard Cohen's music, and this episode can be seen as a companion to that one. So we're excited to get into it with our guest today, Stephen Daniel Arnoff. In addition to being the author of this new book, hosts a podcast with a very similar name, Bob Dylan, About Man and God and Law. And you can listen to that on any of your favorite podcast apps. In addition to being an expert on the spiritual wisdom of Bob Dylan, Stephen Daniel Arnoff is the CEO of the Fuchsberg Jerusalem Center, which is the conservative movement's headquarters in Israel. Prior to that, he served in leadership roles in some great American Jewish institutions, including the 92nd Street Y, the 14th Street Y, and the JCC Association. Not sure what street that's on. He teaches and lectures around the world on the nexus of religion and popular culture, and he has published widely, including contributions to Dylan at Play and Reading the Boss, interdisciplinary approaches to the works of Bruce Springsteen. Stephen Daniel Arnoff also has a doctorate in Midrash and scriptural interpretation from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. So I have to admit that I have been listening to a lot of Bob Dylan preparing for this episode, and I've been having a great experience in doing that. So if the only effect of this conversation is that you're going to go off to your music app and start listening to Bob Dylan again if you haven't for a while, Dayenu, that would be enough of a success for this episode. But I think it's going to be a lot more than that. So Stephen Daniel Arnoff, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It is so great to have you.
For a long time, I've been listening and waiting. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, thanks so much for being with us. So I should confess that my uncle is the big Dylan fan in the family, and I'm more of a Dylan hobbyist, but I will do my best to do justice to my own family legacy and make my uncle proud with this conversation. I think, though, it's interesting. I mean, not to speak for my uncle, but he is from the 60s, so to speak. He really was one of these guys who went around in a VW van. And for him, Bob Dylan really is, I wouldn't say a god, but I mean, close to it. And your book talks about the spiritual wisdom of Bob Dylan. And I'm wondering, first of all, if you could just sort of talk about what led you to take a crack at Bob Dylan from that perspective. But also just, do you think that Bob Dylan was self-conscious or became self-conscious at a certain point, that he was engaged in a quasi-religious project of bringing spiritual wisdom to people? Or do you think that he was just trying to be a troubadour and that he, maybe he was doing it, but a little bit less consciously?
So, look, I think that from the perspective of what Bob Dylan's intention was from a spiritual perspective, I don't speculate about this at all, almost in the book itself. And really, when I think about Dylan or teach about Dylan, I don't speculate too much on his personal spiritual practice. I think that he is probably following his creative curiosity more than anything. So he is, I think, a deeply curious person, I think he has a kind of restless spirit as a maker of music, as a painter, as a writer, as a thinker. And so he attaches himself to what attracts him. And that's a very, very wide range of kinds of content: religious, spiritual, philosophical, musical, and on and on. So what we see is a person who really presents himself in the world as someone who's on a journey of discovery all the time. In his creating of his own Dylan creation myth, he describes this kind of wandering wastrel from the age of 11 and 3/4 or whatever it is, who's running away from home and looking for truth and trying to find adventure and telling people about what he found. And while that's probably mostly made up until he's about 17 or 18, it is, I think, how his spirit sort of manifests as one of deep curiosity. It was very hard for me to accept using the word spirituality in the title of this book. My background academically and in terms of my practice is in Judaism in I hope, a deep way. And the concept of spirituality, that's such a modern American kind of phrasing of what religion means, of what religious experience means. And yet, when we think about one of the main learnings of this period, we think of as the 60s, it's the emergence of different kinds of spiritualities into the world in ways that actually don't feel and sound all that much like the traditional realms that people had emerged from or their parents had emerged from. So I am very interested in my work around Dylan and generally in the ways that this religious sensibility, and drilling down in particular to a Jewish religious sensibility, is expressed in creative life, not just religious creative life, but all creative life. I'm interested in what it means when an artist leads themselves into a place of creativity and questioning and a life of the spirit and doesn't define themselves as a religious person. And I wanted to get into that with Dylan because he's had such a huge impact on the way we think and feel.
So I'm still reflecting on your book. And one thing that I really enjoyed is this blurring to some extent of the person, Bob Dylan, and like the legacy or the impact that they had on others. I don't know if this is like a recognized trend in biographies or in writing or in academic writing, but like I am very refreshed at what feels to me like a different kind of writing than I grew up doing around like historical figures and biographies. Where, you know, when I read I loved biographies when I was a kid. I had like a whole shelf of biographies of historical figures. And the point of the biography was like, here's who the person was. And by the way, some of it was myth, some of it was more accurate, whatever. But there was like, it was about the person. It wasn't about the impact that that person had on the world. If I was reading about George Washington, the idea that I would talk about, that the book would talk about a period that isn't the 1700s was like silly because George Washington lived in the 1700s, right? But what Bob Dylan makes clear, and what honestly most other big historical figures make clear, is that there's their personality and their story and what they do, and there's the impact they have on the Dan's uncles of the world. There's what they mean to people, actually independent of like what they themselves do, but like the mark they leave, the impact they have. And so I'd love to hear from you just to open up those two through lines. Like, tell us a little bit about sort of the person, Bob Dylan, but I'm actually in many ways, both from a Jewish perspective, but also from like a human perspective, interested in Bob Dylan, like capital B, capital D, the deity figure in people's lives, or at the very least, the impact, the influencer of so much of the world that we now inhabit. Yeah.
Well, look, Lex, I think that most of what we know is about the second part of your question, or your second question about the myth, the mythological figure known as Bob Dylan, because that is who Bob Dylan consciously, directedly presents to the world, really since the moment he came to the public stage. This is a guy who changed his name And we know from letters he wrote to an old friend that he did change his name because it was too Jewish. That's a reason that he actually gave in his letters to a pal in the early 70s. This is the age still where Woody Allen is changing his name. It's the same generation. Dylan's a little bit younger, but these are the folks who changed their names. Leonard Cohen, of course, by the way, when asked if he would ever consider changing his name, and I heard this from Sylvie Simmons, his biographer, Leonard Cohen said, I did consider changing my name to September. And the interviewer thought for a moment and thought, interesting. So you would change your name to Leonard September. No, September Cohen. Right. So there's something there that we can come back to about Leonard Cohen's sense of Jewish identity and religious identity and Dylan's. They're very, very different. But Dylan is creating a character. He's creating a character called Bob Dylan. That character of Bob Dylan has many, many faces, and he is an intensely private person. I have read a lot of the biographical work on Dylan because it's important in some sense to get a bit of the real history, the science of Dylan. But let me put it this way. I want to leave Bob Dylan alone. I'm not even sure that I ever want to meet him except to say thank you. I think his privacy that he preserves so carefully is necessary for him to do his work. He is not someone who presents to any depth his personal experience. What Dylan is interested in is making art, making music, making words, and somehow with a strange quirk of personality that has been consistent since the very beginning, he is completely evasive about who he is as a person versus who he is as a creator. And who he is as a creator makes intimacy with people. When Dylan asks us in the song, Like a Rolling Stone, how does it feel? He is asking us the seminal question of our time. And it is an empathetic question and one that resonates to people's depths. But he is not, in the end, actually accepting or admitting to telling us how he, as a person, really feels. It's Bob Dylan, the musician, who's telling us that. And that's one of the great mysteries. But that's what makes him sort of a mythological figure more than the person that you'd want to invite over for dinner. I'm not sure he'd be such a great guest, but he's an incredible topic for a dinner party. To give an even deeper Jewish biographical valence here, one of the exercises of Jewish academia in the 50s and 60s was trying to create biographies of Chazal, of the sages of blessed memory, those who compose our Midrash, the Talmud. They are these vibrant characters. So the idea was, well, let's go back and create biographies of these individuals. And, one of our great scholars, a frustrating one to many, Jacob Neusner of blessed memory, tried to write a biography. That was his first, I think that may have been his doctorate. And the understanding was these are actually composite characters. We don't actually know anything historically about almost anyone in the Talmud, right? And I think it's important to see Dylan without putting him on a pedestal because he's writing as a human being in our lifetime. He is not part of the kind of celebrity culture that we know of today. And in so many ways, he kind of invented it because he knew how to engage and direct people's curiosity and became the must person, the person you needed to be in the room with, and you couldn't be.
So can I ask you about what we've been able to see in terms of what he's produced over really quite a long time? And that's unusual. His artistic and spiritual productivity over the course of, some 60 years, I guess. Mm-hmm. And I was listening to a lot of Dylan songs over the last couple of days, and I was doing it on a kind of shuffle, or I was listening to Apple Music, in order of top songs or whatever, whatever the order was. And it was interesting to experience it that way. And every once in a while, there would be a song that just jumped out at me that I just grabbed me. And I felt like, wow, this is still an amazing song, right? So, for example, The Times They Are Changing, I had that experience. Mm-hmm. But also Hurricane. There were moments where I was just like, wow, there's something really deep that's resonating with me here. It wasn't just that I liked the melody. It was something really hit me, and I sat up and listened to it for a while. And I'm curious whether and to what extent you see change over time in the spiritual wisdom of Bob Dylan. In other words, is he growing as a channeler of spiritual wisdom, or was he almost fully there at 21 years old? And if so, then how do we explain that? How do we think about that? Is there, I was thinking about, are there biblical figures like Jeremiah that we might be able to say, well, this is, if you want to understand Jeremiah, we don't know that much about his biography either. But if you want to understand Jeremiah, just look at Dylan, because you will understand what it's like to be a person who is channeling some kind of important spiritual knowledge and who somehow has that deep inside them when they're extremely young, or are we seeing something, or would you describe it in a different way, that he had something when he was very young, but it actually has grown and evolved over time, and actually the older Dylan, who a lot of people aren't listening to anymore, even though his songs sometimes reach number one, that actually he has a lot more and a lot of new things to say that the younger Dylan didn't know?
I think there's a critical distinction between spiritual wisdom and spiritual practice. So from the perspective of spiritual practice, I'm not a big fan of where Dylan's wound up from the little that I know, because his most vociferous public engagement with religious practice was during a period of time where he was very publicly an evangelical, born-again Christian, right? Where he engaged in it on the most public stage that was available, and it attracted a lot of people and broke a lot of hearts. The other axes where we see Dylan as a publicly engaged in religious practice is his interest and participation in the life of Chabad, of Lubavitch, right? Which, I'm a fan of Chabad, but from a theological perspective, I myself take a much, I hope, more nuanced view to chosenness and the destiny of the Jewish people versus the destiny of other peoples, and the theological necessities of the mitzvot, of the commandments. These are all, I think, more nuanced for me. Dylan essentially seems most comfortable as a fundamentalist in religious practice. That's a very uncomfortable place for me. From the perspective of spiritual wisdom, on the other hand, he is able to convey a feeling, a sensibility about the meaning of life, about the essence of love, about fellowship, justice, feeling left out, loneliness, that I would put on the level of the greatest creators that we've ever known. So you've got a situation which is not uncommon with great artists, where the personal choices can get very messy while the creative choices are at times immaculate, right? It doesn't quite make sense. It doesn't quite fit together. I would not want to write a book about the spiritual practice of Bob Dylan, but the spiritual wisdom of Bob Dylan is actually, well, if we open the Pandora's box of spiritual wisdoms and see all of this incredible content coming out, what do we as individuals and as a society do with all of that? Who is the messenger for all of that? Where does that come from, and why does it come from him? As opposed to asking the question, well, do I need to practice my religion like this guy? For me, the answer is definitely no.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the phrase "practice what you preach," and what I'm kind of hearing is that you want to practice some of the things he preached, but not what he practiced.
Yeah, and on the point of practicing and preaching, Dylan has not presented himself as a teacher or model for anyone. He has not presented himself as a rebbe. He has not presented himself as a master. He has not said, "Follow me." He has said, "Follow no one."
Yeah, and by the way, there's a part of me, which I can never know, right? But there's a part of me that thinks that the best way to get people to follow you is to say, "Don't follow me," right? Like that. There's a part of me where I'm not like, it's not that I think he's insincere. Like if Bob Dylan has a superpower, I think it's deeply his sincerity. But there's a part of me where I'm like, there's millions of people that love specifically that you're not asking to be followed. So that's like a side point, and I'm curious your thoughts on that. I have a question. You use the phrase Pandora's box to opening up the Jewish Pandora's box or boxes that often are in play with Bob Dylan. And I want to just sort of start with not one story, like a set of stories that I've had in my life where I'm in a Jewish space, and for one reason or another, like a synagogue or a Torah study or a JCC or whatever, like a identifying Jewish space, and Bob Dylan comes up, and it's like you snap your fingers and somebody in the room goes, Robert Zimmerman. Mm-hmm. He went to Camp Herzl. I grew up in the Midwest, so Camp Herzl is a Jewish camp, and that's actually one of the very earliest and very influential Jewish camps. And so it matters to people that Bob Dylan went there. And it's like a meme where whenever Bob Dylan arises, the conversation, in my experience, doesn't actually go to the content of his songs, to his. It's like, he's Jewish. Next, like, that's cool. Yeah. Let's talk about the fact that he's Jewish. And first off, we actually, as you said, we don't know whether Bob Dylan today, if you asked him, would say, I am Jewish. I mean, maybe you know better than me. But we have at least some periods of his life where he's actively identified differently. But I'm less interested in the Bob side of this and more, once again, in the people talking about Bob's side of this. Like, we do this thing so much in Jewish life where celebrities' purpose in the world is for us to claim them. Like, the Jewish celebrities, like, what they are in the world is a tally mark in the ongoing count of Jews who have a positive influence in the world. And
another Jew won the Nobel Prize.
Right. Yeah. Oh, and he won a Nobel Prize. Yeah. He covers both of these tally mark things because he's won a Nobel Prize, whatever. And I just have no patience for it. I'm really reaching a point of, and it's probably unhealthy for me personally. Like, I shouldn't be so uncharitable, but like, I'm reaching a point where it's just really bothering me when this consistently happens, because what it does is it takes away like, we think we're doing honor to these Jewish celebrities by saying, like, oh, we love you and you're one of us and that's so great. But we actually just that's the end of the conversation. Like, you do the Hebrew school class where you talk about, here are 25 famous Jewish celebrities, let's make a poster of all of them. And then you don't actually talk about, like, what they were in the world. Ben Stiller's Jewish. Bob Dylan Jewish. Rachel Bloom's Jewish. Tiffany Haddish is Jewish. Like, I'd love to hear from you a little bit diagnostically, like, what's happening as people do that with Dylan, sort of, especially because he actually does not publicly, he doesn't go around talking about, I'm a Jew, I'm a Jew, I'm a Jew. But so why is it that people are so ready to go, Bobby Zimmerman?
It's a great question, Lex. I'm thinking about it from two different perspectives, but they're connected by one concept, which is the concept of belonging. I actually came across a thought when writing my book about how a figure like Dylan, who represents kind of this mythical experience of the 60s, particularly for Jewish, white, middle class, upper middle class young people who have incredible affinity for the civil rights movement. There's this affinity for a kind of other narrative to identify with, because the Jewish narrative had gotten so thin. Let's find somewhere else to belong. This was a time where not just Jews, but any kind of ethnic American, there was a kind of saccharine, nostalgic piece of the ethnicity that was preserved, mostly probably in food, right? And the rest of it was, I want to be an American. I want to be more American than American because I want to belong. And there's a long history of why Jews in majority non-Jewish environments have made choices since the Enlightenment, right? Since the opportunity on a larger scale to make the choice to find something else to do besides doing Jewish. So that makes sense to me, that Dylan would look for an identity and narrative that is thick and rich and interesting. And for him, it was becoming a junior Woody Guthrie. And then it's been becoming all kinds of other figures over time that he has become and embodied and then kind of left behind. And what you have is a trail of Bob Dylan, where the core is this Bob Dylan, this iconoclastic seeker who sheds every identity that he tries on. How does it feel to be on your own, no direction home, a complete unknown? Ask that to millions and millions of first, second, or even third generation Americans who actually don't even know what home is. They don't know where they've come from. And then when we take from the, working backwards in history and thinking about, well, this tendency to sort of identify, like in the book, Stars of David, I think, right? So, hey, David Lee Roth is Jewish. Barbara Streisand is Jewish. All these other figures who, are Jewish or quote unquote part Jewish, the famous Hanukkah song, right, which is a beautiful riff on that funny, strange tendency to want to clamp down and say, this one's Jewish, that one's Jewish. It's also about belonging, because at the end of the day, as much as you can cheer, if you go to YouTube and you look at, the first clip that pops up of Adam Sandler singing the Hanukkah song, you can see that the floor is covered with Jewish fans, right? They're cheering because he's saying to them, it's okay. We belong. We can do this out loud. We can do this in public. So wrestling with that as a talented kid in Hibbing, Minnesota, who has incredible intelligence, deep creative urges, and wants to be somebody, he was not going to be a rabbi. He was going to be Elvis. He was not going to be the circuit rabbi that he saw coming through who did his bar mitzvah. There just wasn't a narrative there that was thick enough, that was grounded enough. And then when you look over the decades of how we kind of obsessively seek the Jewish peace, it is also about saying, is there a place where I can belong here? And if you chose a keyword for Bob Dylan and looked on Google, Jewish would come up in your top 10, if not your top 5, because there's something about him being the Jewish figure that is relevant and interesting, both from the comfortable and the not comfortable side. And to just tie that thought together, when Dylan went electric, quote unquote, and I had a really fascinating conversation that I'm going to share on my podcast with Catherine Lofton, who's the Dean of Humanities at Yale University, and wrote a wonderful piece about religion and Dylan, quote unquote, going electric. How is Dylan known mythologically when he goes electric? He is called Judas. Judas, the most famous Jew of all time, except for one other Jew whose name also begins with J. So you can be the most famous musician in the world. You can be the guy that the Beatles are looking up to and asking what's next. And you can still be Judas. And that's one of the creative tensions of Dylan and the Jewish piece.
It's funny because I actually wanted to get on this question of Dylan and Jesus, because I'm thinking about Jesus as really only having 3 years of a professional life. And we don't know what Jesus would have done had he been able to live to the age of 80. And I'm thinking about Dylan and also Leonard Cohen. I mean, this is back to my earlier question that we've seen them create for over half a century. And I'm thinking about how we might claim them for the project that this podcast is interested in, which is the reimagination of a new version of Judaism that would take us through the next number of centuries or millennia. And I'm thinking about why do we feel that that's needed? And I think that there's a sense that, and it didn't just start in the 60s, I think it started with the Enlightenment, but this idea that, and I don't remember the exact quote in your book, but how you talk about that art and a certain kind of philosophy is needed when the world is falling apart. And I think that when we look at where some of these major revolutions that have taken place in how Judaism, and not only Judaism, other traditions, other civilizations, other cultures look, is when they are contending with what to do after their world has fallen apart. And it feels to me that the impulse that you're talking about for Dylan to say, I don't want to be a rabbi, I don't want to be stuck in this narrow world of Judaism. It's both because Judaism has fallen apart, but it's also because the world is falling apart, and he has a bigger stage that he can talk to. He doesn't only want to talk to just Jews, and I don't only want to talk to just Jews, right? I mean, I imagine that a new version of Judaism would have an appeal far beyond, and maybe it would be better to call it something else as well, with stuff that we've debated and discussed. But let's say that we're imagining that there is a project of reimagining, whether we want to call it Judaism or some kind of new spiritual approach that will include practice, but let's talk about practice later. Mm-hmm. But now we're just looking for the philosophy. Can we tap into Dylan as one of our prophets? And if so, what is he saying? What is he asking us to do? And is he asking something new of us? Or is he really just asking something very old of us, but putting it into language and into images that we can relate to in a way that people are having trouble relating to a lot of the ancient images that seem to be at the heart of Jewish practice and Jewish philosophy as they've heard of it in their, Jewish educations?
You started with the concept of Jesus of Nazareth as having had a 3-year career, and look at the impact of that 3-year career. That's a really amazing record. And the question of whether, artists, prophets, leaders of a certain kind, do they come out whole, already expressing their message when they're 23, and then it's just a slightly evolved message when they're 73 or 83? There's a lot to be said about those framings. The question of what one might take from Dylan as a quote unquote Jewish prophet, I'm interested in answering that question in a way that works both with the micro, which I'll call the Jewish, which is to me also the macro, and the macro, which is people, right? Human beings, which is also the micro, right? And I'm not trying to evade it. I am trying to apply, in this sense, something that is deeply humanist and deeply values the concept of all of us being created, B'Tselem Elokim, all of us created in the image of God. And I do mean all of us, not just those of us who may have a little bit of Hebrew in their DNA, but those of us who are human beings on the earth. But at the same time, that there is something about the particularism of Jewish history, the tribal element, the family element. What are the different elements that define what it means to be Jewish? That really matters to me in the deepest way as well. I will say, listening to Dylan as a kind of prophetic figure is a worthwhile endeavor, wherever you are on the scale of the particular, the Jewish micro/macro, or the humanist micro/macro. Dylan, as a philosopher, is teaching around the question of what does it mean to live the good life? What does it mean to live a life of meaning? These are the questions that he's been wrestling with since the very beginning. His first album really is mostly about death. He's 20, 21 years old, and most of his songs, he sounds like he's 70. Then he really enters into the realm of songs about liberation, a lot of songs about both personal liberation from whatever kind of shackles one might inherit, and also social liberation. You cited Times They Are Changing. And it gets more and more personal with Dylan, right? That's one of the other reasons he was called Judas, because he went from singing about the times they are changing to singing about basically love, personal seeking, personal hurt. Where in that is the philosophy that can be manifest in making the world a better place to live? Where is the tikkun? Where is the healing? Right? The tikkun olam, the healing of the world within the philosophy. And I really believe that the core message for me is one of empathy. Does a particular religious tradition have the text, the spiritual practice, the social structures, the culture to imbue in its participants empathy? I do not accept a religious practice of any kind, of any tradition, that does not embed within itself empathy for the other, period. I don't care how learned you are. I don't care how spiritually attuned you are. I don't care what messages you're receiving on high. If you are not able to pause and ask the question that Dylan asks, how does it feel of yourself and the person you are standing in front of? You are not a religiously engaged person. You are using religion as an excuse to hurt people. But another piece that's happening here, everything that Dylan does is about repetition. He is a musician. He comes from the folk tradition. He is replaying ideas and melodies and lyrics that have already been sung. Like any religious person, only through inventory do we have invention, right? You've got to have an inventory of raw material, of philosophically, religiously, spiritually meaningful content. The question is how you rearrange it in a way that's accessible to others. And there's another piece here, and that is you need to actually be a bit desolate. You need to see your own brokenness in order to be able to be a healer. That to me feels like a deep teaching that one would find in the Hasidic tradition, many other traditions as well. I think of Leonard Cohen, who famously sang, "There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." So the fact that these songs are on the radio in 1965, and the fact that these songs are still being sung and are still essential building blocks for so many musicians and thinkers and artists now, is to me a kind of popular culture sacred text and a kind of philosophy of popular culture that we need to repeat, because those values of empathy, of humility, are actually what's missing. And if you look around in the world at the kind of leaders that we put above us, it is more often than not those who demonstrate lack of empathy and lack of humility.
So I like that you're bringing up questions of empathy and humility. I want to name something that feels important from my perspective. I mean, I haven't voiced this yet, but when Bob Dylan comes up, I'm not a huge Bob Dylan fan. I don't listen to a lot of Bob Dylan's music, and I'm not going to claim my reasons for that are super sophisticated. When I listen to music, I'm really interested in like vibing to really good singers, like vocal quality, and it's hard for me to listen to Bob Dylan. And I've actually been gifted by my mother a CD of covers of Bob Dylan's beautiful, incredible lyrics by other singers, because I actually don't enjoy his voice very much. And I recognize that part of the magic, like part of the whole thing, is that he didn't have a trained voice and wasn't like sounding quote unquote like you were supposed to. But I want to name that piece because I think Bob Dylan's biography, Bob Dylan's life story, Bob Dylan's influence, his impact, they're only possible because he was a white guy in a certain sense. Like you couldn't be an equivalent to Bob Dylan with an untrained voice and have this career. That's like the first Dayenu. You couldn't be a Bob Dylan figure who you talk about in your book, how he might have written some of his songs in 15 minutes. You couldn't shoot from the hip and just sort of do the beautiful style of like, I don't want to call it extemporaneous. It wasn't fully improvised, but like just sort of stream of consciousness if you were not a white guy, probably. Or you could, but it wouldn't get as widely known. And so I want to name that, not because I think we should throw away Bob Dylan's music, not because I don't myself like identify deeply as somebody who has been influenced by his wonderful songs and lyrics, but I want to bring up a figure that to me is parallel in many ways and who is being lost to my generation and future generations of both people and Jews. I want to talk about Carole King. So Carole King is another Jew who changed her name, was a product of the same time period, was among the most massively influential musicians of her time period. I didn't know any of this until my parents dragged me to a Carole King concert when I was 12 or 13. I didn't even know who she was. And I looked around the room and it was clear to me that I was at like a religious worship ceremony, and that what people were doing was absolutely like people were connecting to their, Rebbe or teacher, not that Carole King, like Bob Dylan, would call herself that. But there's something about her that I feel like is not being preserved as deeply over time. And we could say that her ambitions, I don't know that what she was trying to do with her songwriting was like upend or change. I don't know that what she was doing was parallel to what Bob Dylan was doing. But I just wanted to bring that up because we so often talk about Bob Dylan's magic, which is this sort of it's that he wasn't Leonard Cohen spending years to write his masterpiece songs.
Mhm.
It's that he was able to be this curmudgeonly kind of figure and take choices with his private life. Like, how might we think about this cohesively? And I didn't really ask this from a Jewish place, but to the extent that this matters to how we recognize and remember Jewish celebrities like Carole King versus others, how might we deepen this conversation?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think that it's essential in any exercise of thinking about meaning and culture to keep in mind, that it's just obligatory to open up the space to difference, period. Dylan's been just okay, I think, on that. But some amazing artists have really resonated with him. Nina Simone, I think, has done the most incredible covers of Dylan's music. Betty Levette, who has an album just of Dylan covers, Mavis Staples. So from the perspective of Carole King, for example, maybe my top 3 rock and roll moments of all time is when Aretha Franklin, when Carole King was honored at the Kennedy Center, sang, "You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman." If you're not weeping by the end of that song, I don't think you're human. Here is Aretha Franklin, who is, by I think every measure, the greatest vocalist in the history of popular music. I mean, this woman had skills and feeling and capacities that just are unmeasurable, and the ability to express, who did what Aretha wanted to do. She didn't have to come and honor Carole King, the songwriter, by singing that song of woman's liberation, Black woman to white woman, as Carole King sits next to Barack and Michelle Obama. It's happening because a post-Tin Pan Alley Jewish songwriter named Carole King writes with her soon-to-be ex-husband, Gary Goffin, "You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman," right? And Aretha Franklin turns it into magic. Dylan songs also are turned into magic. Now, Adele is white, but I don't think that most people know a Dylan song better than "Make You Feel My Love," which is Adele. Adele made that hit for Dylan. The way that race difference is blurred, the way that religious difference is blurred, the imperfection of how white artists and Black artists are recognized and rewarded is deeply, deeply flawed. In terms of creating America's number one export, perhaps outside of Hollywood, right, which is music, clearly, that doesn't exist without Black music. A white Jewish guy comes along by the name of Bob Dylan and in some ways co-opts it, right? And yet somewhere in this messy mess of culture, identity coming together, everyone has to lend a hand. And everyone has to recognize that no one can lord it over on anyone else, because the whole point of American culture is that it comes from so many different sources. So I don't know if I've done justice to Carole King in my answer, but I've tried to do justice to the complexity and beauty that comes from the cultural rugby scrum that is popular music.
Well, it gets me thinking about like the stage that comes after the artist's productivity, the artist's production. I mean, may he live till 120, but after Dylan dies, what is somebody's legacy? And maybe more broadly, what is the legacy of this whole era in popular music? And one of the things that got me to sit up last night as I was listening to Dylan songs was the line in The Times They Are Changin', right, that says, "And don't speak too soon for the wheel's still to spin, and there's no telling who that it's naming, for the loser now will be later to win, for the times they are changin'." And I've been stuck on this line from Psalms for a long time, that the stone that the builders rejected will become the cornerstone. Because when we're talking about our audience and the people that have been disenchanted with the Jewish mainstream, and to say to them, it's not only that you have a place in it, it's that you have a central place in the next version, if only you will take it, right? And to me, that line in The Times They Are Changin' was feeling like an echo of that idea. don't assume that you know who the winner is in the story. And I was thinking like, okay, and that's one of, I don't know how many hundreds of songs Dylan has written. And the question, I guess, for me at a certain point is not about what the artist intended, but what we do with what that artist created and how we sort of boil it down to say, okay, not necessarily what is the spiritual wisdom that he intended to give to us, but what is the spiritual wisdom that we have found in his work and in the work of others. So there I'll include Leonard Cohen and Carole King and everyone else and Beyonce. And that makes the project even more complex because we're going to really have to, there's so much, I guess is what I'm asking. And for me, the other person that I've been stuck on for a long time lately is Marie Kondo, the idea of tidying up and the idea that there is an important spiritual task in sifting through the gems. And one of the things that Marie Kondo, I think, is really quite brilliant about pointing out to us is she's not saying that we should throw away crap. We know we should throw away crap. She's saying you're going to have to throw away things that you love, things that have been important to you on your journey. And part of her spiritual wisdom, in my view, is the idea that you pick up every single thing and you hold it close to you and you ask, not has this been important to me on my journey up till now, but is there a reason why this needs to continue on my journey with me? And if it doesn't, then you thank it for its service up till this point and you find it a good new home and you say, but this is not going to come with me on my spiritual journey. So I'm kind of wondering how you think about this next phase in the cultural life of Bob Dylan and others. How do we sift through it and identify those parts of it that really are important as we imagine bringing them forward and maybe bringing them forward into some kind of new, I don't necessarily want to say religion, but into some new spiritual container that our next task will probably have to be to devise the practices that make that wisdom real in the world.
So the question, for listeners who come to your conversations here with real sensibilities of mistrust or disappointment or anxiety around the religious systems that Judaism brings to us, inherited systems that seem to be boring or nonsensical or chauvinist, overtly racist, or overtly destructive, whatever it is, whatever damage people project upon or glean from tradition, the tradition is asking each and every one of us to be curious, to get inside, to flatten it, to deepen it, to share it, to question it. And isn't that part of what we think about when we think of the sensibility of the 60s? And if we think about a sensibility of the 60s, as Google will show us, Bob Dylan's going to come up like he is one of the archetypal figures, despite the fact that he's been creating for 50 years, right, since that time. And in the book, I talk about Dylan and Franz Kafka, who both share a parable of being locked out from the splendor of tradition because there's a guard at the door who will not let us in. And the parable that comes from the book, The Trial, Kafka's figure, who's a man from the country. It is a man. It is perhaps a play on the concept Am Haaretz, who is sort of like a country bumpkin or an ignorant man who is standing before an imposing guard. And there is a locked gate between this person from the country and getting inside, which inside seems to be some kind of glorious kingdom, some kind of truth, some kind of castle of knowledge and understanding and nirvana. And that person waits and waits and waits and asks meaningless questions until they're so weak that they can no longer go through that locked door. They can no longer go through that gate. And the guard just smiles and says, it's really too bad, my friend, because this gate was for you. If only you had just taken your hand to the handle and opened it. We have to think that way about all of our inherited traditions, because if we don't, those same inherited traditions that invite love and empathy and understanding are the same traditions that invite war and mistrust and division and boredom. And it is incumbent upon those of us who are interested in popular culture, who care about the world at the same time, to think, is there a message here that leads to a practice? Is there a message within this film, this song, this collection of literature that I care so much about that might be something that a community could be built around? Is there a way to do good in the world thanks to that work that this artist did? That's what interests me. And that's why I wrote the book, because I really believe that the crisis of religion, one of the many results was a renaissance in culture. It is because of the doors slamming shut in religion that artists found another way to express the highest values of religion, which has always been on the precipice of doing bad, right? Of doing wrong, of division. There's always a chance to reverse it.
So I wanted to close with the question of like how we utilize, I hate that term, but like how we mobilize Bob Dylan's creations, works moving forward, both in the world, but also I am thinking a little bit about Jewish life, just given the context of our podcast. I grew up and Blowin' in the Wind was in my camp's songbook. It was probably a few pages away from a bunch of like Hebrew language songs from the Bible. It implicitly to the fact that they're in the same songbook and used in the same, after meal song sessions, like there's kind of an equivalence being drawn. And so just in my body, like Blowin' in the Wind is not just a pop song. It's like in the same category as other kinds of sacred things that I experienced at camp. But I had an experience, I guess not just a few years ago, probably about 10 years ago now, where I did not grow up like reading all the classic Jewish texts and knowing everything inside and out. I was for the first time reading the book of Ecclesiastes, which to this has become one of my very, very favorite books of the entire Bible. We'll throw a show note to it for those who haven't read it or don't know what I'm talking about. But if you had to distill the book of Ecclesiastes' messaging down to a few stanzas, I really think the song Blowin' in the Wind does it. The refrain of the book of Ecclesiastes is all life is the Hebrew word havel, which is often translated as vanity, but it's related to the word for wind or for vapor. It's like, everything's impermanent and it all blows in the wind. And so I really think that if somebody were in a Jewish setting and like, Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes is kind of long, and are you going to read it all? It's associated with the holiday of Sukkot, but do people really read the whole thing? Like, I actually think it would be like true for somebody today to be like, okay, Blowin' in the Wind is our Ecclesiastes, and we're going to engage with the thoughts of the questions of the book of Ecclesiastes on impermanence, on wind, through this contemporary text that is familiar. I think that that's a legitimate move somebody could make. I think they could pair it with Ecclesiastes. I think there's all sorts of things we could do. But just moving forward, I'm not asking like, is it okay for us to do this with Bob Dylan's music? From my perspective, it is happening everywhere. Bob Dylan's music is being invoked in sacred contexts. By the way, not just Jewish ones.
Of course.
All over the place. So the question isn't like, is that allowed? Are we permitted? I don't. We're permitted. Given that we're permitted, do you have tips or tricks or strategies for how people might actually do it? Because in your book, what I'm saying with Ecclesiastes and Bob Dylan, you do it with Ibn Ezra and Bob Dylan. You do it with a number of times. How might we go about this act of blending ancient text and Bob Dylan text, or how would you advise us on this as we close?
It's really interesting. The parallel between Ecclesiastes and Blowin' in the Wind, that's a good one. And, Ecclesiastes comes from, what I think a biblical scholar would call the wisdom literature. Blowin' in the Wind is a really good example of a wisdom literature type song with compelling imagery. And you see that in Ecclesiastes. And then the rhetorical question. And there is a kind of darkness to the answer. The answer is blown in the wind, an open-ended question, a sense of a lack of closure. Now, when Dylan went to sing before the Pope, I don't remember which Pope it was, the Pope whispered in his ear, the answer isn't blowing in the wind. The answer is Jesus Christ, right? Anyone could answer the question. But if you answer the question, you've closed the process, right? You've shut off the wisdom. Ask the question and hold the tension of what the question brings you to. So if we kind of imagine how to ritualize wisdom, where are some of the places that happens? The tradition of piyut, of liturgical poetry, which is very strong in Judaism, and the most famously appears in the realm of the Kabbalat Shabbat, of the Shabbat services. That's very late piyut. That's very late liturgical poetry. Adon Olam, right, which is for a lot of us, myself included, that was probably the only Hebrew song I knew growing up, start to finish. That's a piyut. The idea is that they're sort of values expressing ditties that were repeated, and just repeating an idea over and over again. Dylan is all about the repetition. Most religious traditions are all about the repetition. What phrase from the songbook resonates? What particular melody from the songbook resonates? Put it into a place in the prayer service, put it into a place in one's meditations or thinkings, put it into the place where one writes it in your journal, in the same way that we would meditate upon a sacred text. And the idea here is not to make Dylan divine. The idea here is to say that something divine passed through this artist in the same way that I would say that something divine passed through Joni Mitchell. Bring that with you to the place you make meaning. Is it uncomfortable because there's too much English for those of us who are more interested in praying in Hebrew or Latin or whatever language it is? That's something that you just have to sort out by doing it. But to not be afraid to bring in the so-called secular into the places where we make meaning. I don't think Dylan would necessarily describe himself as writing prayer, but he has written prayers. Forever Young is a kind of prayer, for example. So the next time you're casting about for a text and looking for something to say to that child, or to say to that child, whether it's the baby or the one who gave birth to the child, or at the moment of a child's union with that child's partner, imagine what it would be to take a song in a language that you know and are comfortable with, and to share that song in the same way that one might share Hebrew liturgy. And at the same time, for those who are interested in a particular spiritual tradition, to actually allow that spiritual tradition into that popular song as well. It's not a one-way street. It's not about just singing Dylan songs in the Shabbat service. It's about imagining how the Shabbat service can live in Dylan's songbook as well. Dig into it, get messy with it, invite it to your table or your tabernacle. And I think that that is a step beyond perhaps what Dylan may have intended for his music, but because he is a channel for so much spiritual wisdom, it's natural that some of those songs present themselves as songs that really can memorialize points of life that matter. And a final point on that, which is just a fact of life, everybody has a soundtrack. What's your soundtrack? Curate it carefully.
Thank you so much, Stephen Daniel Arnoff, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Oh, I've really enjoyed it. What wonderful questions, and the thoughtfulness that went into the conversation really is not surprising, but to be able to participate in this way is a very special honor.
Well, thank you so much for saying that. It's an honor, of course, to have you, and it's an honor to have all of our listeners out there listening. So thanks for doing that. And we want to close out this conversation in the same way that we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us. We also encourage you, of course, to read Stephen Daniel Arnoff's new book. You can see a show note to it on our website if you want to give it a purchase and a read. Definitely encouraged. But here are the ways that you can be in touch with us. First, there are our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, there is our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And third, there are our email addresses, dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. Just send both of us, one of us, any kind of note, a question, a thought, an argument, whatever you've got. We love receiving those emails. So the last thing is that we deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you're able to send our way. And you can do that on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift at judaismunbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound. 142 more days of Shemitah.